Hello and welcome to the India Hangout. Will PSU disinvestments go forth in the manner that they've been planned? Will they raise anywhere between 30 to 60 or 70,000 crores? And more so, and more importantly, what will this achieve? And if so, how will this be done? I'm joined to discuss this by Subir, Gokarn, Director Research at Brookings, narayan, Vyas, politician and former Gujarat Cabinet Minister, Prithvi, Haldea of Prime Database. The question we are asking is, can the PSU disinvestment or divestment be taken forth in the manner that it should be? And if so, how should it be done? And what are the lessons from the past, if so? Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us in this Business Standard exclusive discussion that we're doing today. Subir, let me begin with you. What are the key strategies that, or the strategy that should be followed if the whole process of disinvestment were to be rolled forward as it has been talked about, particularly in the last few weeks?
Well, I think there is a generic strategy that needs to be followed. And this has been something that was talked about many years ago when disinvestment was actually being seen as a legitimate long-term resource mobilization exercise by the government. But it has been a very spotty, process. We had a few years when significant assets were sold, but by and large over the last 10 years it's been relatively small in terms of the amount of money that was raised. I think we need to divide up PSUs into, let's say, 4 categories. Maybe 3, maybe 5, but just for illustration, let me say 4. The first is, what we've been talking about as Navaratnas, or, the sort of prime assets, the blue chips, which are very sound, solid going concerns because of the market environment they operate in, because of the products they produce, the service they produce. And those essentially have value as going concerns, and you need to be able to realize that value through the stock market. That's the obvious route, and that's essentially how we went about it in past episodes. The second lot are companies that have value as going concerns, because they're in kinds of businesses that offer reasonably good value propositions for stakeholders. Offhand I can't think of an example. I'm just creating the categories.
Sure.
And these need to be sort of taken to a point where the market finds them acceptable. And I think there is a sort of a strategic direction and a strategic effort that needs to be made to get these companies. The third category, I think, are companies that essentially are not very valuable as going concerns. That companies that are better off or more valuable to the government as just bundles of assets, not as going concerns. And these need to be broken up into the best possible disaggregation of assets, whether it's real estate, whether it's land, whether it's other rights. And these assets sold off. And the fourth category, I suppose, the residual category, are companies that really don't have very much value, who have not hired people for the last 20-25 years, whose workforces have essentially all retired, and all you have is a pension liability and a bunch of relatively low value assets. And these just need to be shut down. The liability has to be the pension liability has to be absorbed by the government onto its budget or in some other way, and these companies just shut down. So where the value is going to be realized, I think, is in the first 3 categories. You have a direct sort of market offering kind of strategy in the first category. You have a development, a sort of mentoring, and then a IPO or FPO in the second category. And third is asset sales, whatever they are. Now we have something like 250, if I remember right, public enterprises, and I'm sure there will be a fairly large number in each of these categories. And it's really up to the disinvestment ministry or whoever is administering this process, right, to ministry anymore as part of the Ministry of Finance now, with the Department of Disinvestment, to work through this process of deciding which enterprise falls into which category and getting the maximum value. I think the objective should be value maximization. How much money can the government realize as quickly as possible, and basically do what is necessary to realize that value.
Right. Okay. Let's get. I'm going to come to Prithvi Haldea in a second. Mr. Vyas, good evening to you too. There are obviously many examples from the state of Gujarat, and they've all been discussed in some detail in the past. Companies like Gujarat State Fertilizer Corporation, Alkalis, Gujarat Electricity Board, Gujarat Narmada Fertilizers Corporation. Now, all of these are cases of instances of companies which were state-run, not doing very well, but brought into profitability and some measure of financial stability. What are the, let's say, the headline lessons that one can take away from how these companies have been turned around, and then we'll come to whether it can be replicated elsewhere. Right. Okay. I think we have a problem with Mr. Vyas's connection. Mr. Haldea, let me come to you, and let me flip the same question that I asked Subir earlier. If you were to look at it from a primary market absorption and capacity capacity and capability point of view, what is the sort of appetite that you see at this point, and how can this be best managed given the condition of the overall secondary and then primary markets?
Before coming to the primary market, I agree with Subir, especially in terms of categorization of the various. However, my categorization would be slightly different in the sense that there are PSUs which are listed. If you look at there is enough, disclosures, they have gone through public scrutiny. There is interest of the investors in those companies, and I think there should be an immediate attempt of the government, given the market conditions in the low economy, to 25% public shareholding at the earliest, then even targeted a 49% public shareholding going forward in the next couple of years. These are all, as we know, are Maharatnas, and they are very good companies, and there is enough appetite for these companies going forward. The second is the profitable companies in the PSU which are yet not listed, and I think we should look at an early IPO for these companies, whether it is RIM or Haldea or any other company. And we should have a strategy of doing an IPO for these companies at the early. The third is to look at companies which are non-strategic and loss-making. I think the government should take a call instantly to find a strategic way out to sell these assets through a very transparent method. There is no need for the government to be in those sectors, and B, to continuously support them through budgetary allocations because they are loss making. And therefore, I think non-strategic loss making companies, the government should have a plan to get out of them as soon as possible. As far as the first part, your primary market is concerned, I think appetite. We always talking about the lack of appetite or the concerns about appetite. I've always found in my 25 years that in case the offering is good and the price is right, the combination and the general mood is upbeat, then appetite is not an issue, because we are looking at 2,000 plus FIIs, we are looking at domestic institutions, we are looking at huge retail investment base. I think put all of this together, we are still talking of 40, 50, 60,000 crores, which is small sum of money. Look at the kinds of IPOs that China has floated and raised money in the last 2 to 3 years. I think appetite exists, and my suggestion has been that for the PSUs which are already listed, and there you have to have a dilution to reach 25% public shareholding. I think the government should announce all retail policy. We continue to mourn about the lack of retail investors in the market. We should offer a great opportunity, give them at a discount to the market price. Retail will just fall in line. You will have millions of new investors come to the market. There is always this concern: why should there be a discount for the retail? Government should maximize revenue. I mean, there are multiple objectives of divestment. One is maximization of revenue, but at the same time, we also want to look at large capital markets. We want more investors to come in, and I think the best way to get many small investors into the market for the first time is through a PSU stock. So I think we should not look at institutional sales, and there is this is public wealth going back to the public. So some discount is offered. There are no questions asked. There is no inquiry there. And I think we should look at using divestment of listed stocks as a great opportunity to increase the retail investor base.
Right. Okay. So I'll come to that discount bit in a moment. Mr. Vyas, I don't know if you can hear me. Are you able to hear me? We couldn't reach you in the previous time I tried. Mr. Vyas? Okay, I think we're still having a problem with Mr. Vyas. Subir, let me come back to you. Now, there are examples like Air India, which are clearly, taking away a lot of taxpayers' money on one end, and on the other hand, you have in terms of strategy for disinvestment or privatization, you'll have all the relatively better off PSUs, which obviously are much more attractive to the market at that point. What should the balance be from a strategic point of view and from a, let's say, a political management point of view?
Well, I think you cannot strip the political angle out of this equation. You just cannot. I mean, whether you're dealing with companies like Air India or the banks, because when it comes to the recapitalization of banks over the next 5 years under the Basel III requirements, the new norms, consolidation, it may not be so much disinvestment, but consolidation itself is going to cause a certain amount of political stress, because unions are going to oppose it. So there is a larger political management challenge, I think, to address, both in terms of the PSU genre and in specifically the banks, although the challenges may emerge from different sources. But the issue is, if you want to keep the current employees in some fashion, or protect them from the consequences of privatization, essentially it means assuming the salary and pension liability, guaranteeing them that their lifetime financial benefits will not be impacted. I think that is the sort of political offer that needs to be put on the table. Now, can you do that? Can you afford to do that? And if you, what is the best way in which that can be achieved? I think is the question that the strategy needs to address. How are you going to guarantee this? If you can't do it, are you going to
Okay, Mr. Vyas, I don't know if we've got you back there. We seem to be having a little bit of a problem. So my question really to you is, where the rubber meets the road in terms of improving the health of some of these public sector or state sector enterprises before you even take them public or before you make them attractive for investors. What's the kind of challenge that you've seen, particularly in the context of Gujarat, where you've brought companies to profitability, and maybe the lessons that can be taken from there at the more central level?
Well, we've seen these experiments quite closely. I would say, to begin with, the government of Gujarat followed a strategy that earlier, these type licensing days, those items which were either to reserve for the public sector or the state sector were picked up for implementation, and the licenses were applied for. And GSFC, GNFC or Gujarat Alkalis, they became a public limited company which came out with the public issues right from day one. And that's how they were implemented, and since then they have been a listed public limited companies, with government maintaining a comfortable and controlling stake and controlling the board as well as the controlling day-to-day administration through the managing director appointed by the government. This is the model that the government of Gujarat followed as far as the companies which you mentioned earlier are concerned.
So what's the okay, so that's, let's say these are companies obviously, had market potential, whether it's fertilizer or alkalis or electricity and so on. Though not all electricity boards have been doing well. What about companies which have not been doing well and where perhaps, let's say, there's been more resistance from unions and employees and so on?
Well, there were companies like Gujarat Tractors Limited, Polymer Corporation of Gujarat, quite a few of them, including this Gujarat Machine Tools, which government of Gujarat has successfully offloaded, and they have been either handed over to some private sector entrepreneur, or they have been closed or merged. For example, there was a unit called Girnar Scooters, which produced scooters during mid-70s. It didn't do well. Ultimately, it was merged with Gujarat Navda Fertilizers, and then later on, even that was not found viable. It was given up. Hindustan Tractors at Baroda, similarly, which was known as Gujarat Tractors, was closed down. Gujarat Machine Tools at Bhavnagar, similarly, was closed down. Polymer Corporation of Gujarat also was closed down. So government of Gujarat has followed a policy of beyond a point, not tolerating this kind of indefinite sickness as far as the public sector or state sector units are concerned, and either merging them with the state sector profit-making units or closing them down with successful negotiations with the employees of the concerned corporation or the concerned company.
So, Mr. Vyas, what's the single biggest or single one or two biggest roadblocks that this approach could face, and how did, let's say, Gujarat surmount them?
Well, I think the first roadblock going the faces is the transparency, which is always questioned. I think one of the things that has plagued the disinvestment in the central public sector is always some controversy or the other that has dodged it, and the issues regarding transparency, and even a person like Mr. Shauri, who could not have been, I think, as far as his integrity is concerned, questioned, but even he was brought into the controversy. So this is one thing that matters a lot. The transparency with which you decide the disinvestment policies and then offload the assets. So if that is possible to be done, or if there is reasonable openness in doing it, I think other issues are subordinate. You can successfully negotiate with the employees, and they are also willing to talk sense because they are ultimately concerned about their own employment and their own well-being and resettlement. So I think if you can do this, ultimately you are able to free the money which are locked up in these kind of assets and use them for some better alternatives. And I think this is what government of Gujarat has successfully done over a period of years.
Right. So, Subir, how do you read that? You know, the whole an atmosphere of transparency in which the transaction is done, which itself is very tricky, because I'm assuming at a central level the scrutiny is far greater. There is political, there is a political microscope on every divestment or disinvestment that will take place. The people, or as in the case of Arun Shauri, will be themselves under scrutiny. So how does one manage this, or could this be managed more effectively this time around?
Well, I think you have to learn from the experience of the past, and clearly any process that is perceived to be opaque or not even-handed, that benefits are flowing unfairly to some individuals, is really going to be questioned, and is going to be that much more difficult to manage the political fallout of it. And I don't think we should underestimate the political fallout. I think that's something that is going to be there and needs to be managed. But I think the way to do it, and we saw this to some extent in the previous episodes, is to make sure that everybody understands what the valuation methods are. Let there be some sort of a debate on how these assets are to be valued, whatever category of assets you might have. There may be multiple ways to value assets. They will arrive at some range, an upper bound and lower bound, and you find a middle ground. And this is, I think, it's a practical and relatively transparent way to do this, because you're not favoring any particular stakeholder, and you're not perceived to be favoring any particular stakeholder if you value them multiple ways, in different ways.
Right. So,
and you arrive at some sort of middle ground there to decide how, what is the price at which the transaction is going to actually take place. Right. So there are two aspects to this. We're not, I think, getting into the second aspect, which is the perception of transparency in how the funds are used. What are the funds going to be used for? Are they going to be just pooled into the general budget, the consolidated fund, and be used as like any other government resources, any other public resources, or are they going to be dedicated to some very clearly identified development activity? And I think that's a second side, a second dimension to the issue, which actually I think will help significantly in managing the politics of the process. But that's not an issue we're discussing today. We're talking about the process of selling assets and realizing the value.
Right, and in the context of the union budget, of course, on July 10th, Mr. Haldea, let me come to you. So we've picked out two issues from a strategic point of view. So one is clearly the broader transparency that goes into it, and secondly, there is the specific transparency which is to do with valuation and then potentially the utilization of the proceeds. How would you see it from a market point of view? I mean, does this matter at all? Where the money is going, how is it going, or is it something that should be kept in mind too?
So again, you see, as far as divestment proceeds are concerned of the district stocks, that can go to the CFI and can be used for development projects. I don't think we need to earmark projects as far as business stocks are concerned. But get to strategic sales, especially of loss-making assets. I think the transparency is very, very critical. Number one. Number two, the valuation has to be put up in public domain. And then you have an auction process which is transparent, where there is no one-on-one negotiation. It's a transparent process, and everybody who qualifies for a technical bid is allowed to participate in that bid. Once you allow that, then the important thing is employees is going to be always a major concern. And my suggestion has been that the proceeds of such strategic assets should actually be first used for employee compensation. And whatever is left to then use for whatever projects you want to set up, because employees, in case they become an impediment, first of all, employees may be absorbed by the private buyers. If they are not absorbed by the private buyers, then a specific funds could be allocated for the benefit of the employees, because you are going to close down the units is going to lead to a lot of political debate also. So I think the funds should be first taken for employees, and as long as you have a transparent process where bidding is open to one and all who qualifies technically, and then it's a public process, it's a process on the website, it's not across the table. I think it will not draw any kind of debate, and because the problem is that in case you either set up RFP in a manner where only one company or two companies are able to qualify, you put two of those conditions and make it opaque, or you have technical bids which are subject to some negotiations. I think if we can get rid of all those and make the whole process very transparent, then we should get down to selling. Mr. Jaranan very rightly mentioned, why should the government continue to bleed on bleeding assets? I mean, we have to put a stop, get rid of those assets, merge them or get rid of them, so that at least there are no fresh flows into those assets, and the government does not have to bleed continuously.
So I don't know. I wish it was as easy as easier said than done, as they say. Let me come back to Mr. Vyas. What about utilization of proceeds, Mr. Vyas? Was that an issue that you grappled with in Gujarat?
Well, I think utilization of the proceeds are concerned, it ultimately goes to the general funds of the government.
Okay.
As far as the government dues are concerned, if at all there are any statutory liabilities, they go towards payment of these dues also, like locked up salaries or PF dues or whatever are the defaulting liabilities. Bearing that, I think it is entirely up to the government, because ultimately it is their investment that they are taking it back. So ultimately it goes to the, and as you are aware, going budgetary process of the government doesn't permit anything that comes to the government go out of it unless appropriate budgetary provisions are made. Unless you create a separate account in the government that as the proceeds will go there, and then that separately will be planned. Ultimately, it goes to the consolidated funds, and they are used for whatever priorities are assigned through the budget to the purpose for which they are assigned.
Right. Subir, let me come back to you. The reason we are going into this whole round of disinvestment, at least optically, seems to be the fact that we need to raise money. Now, does that in some ways contradict with what could be or should be the larger purpose of disinvestment or divestment, which is to make enterprises more efficient, which is to make the economic or the play in the economy far more efficient?
No, I think it's perfectly legitimate to look at disinvestment as a way of raising money. I think the government has to look at its balance sheet, look at what is the appropriate set of assets that it has to own in order to achieve its larger welfare development objectives. And if there is a set of assets which it does not need to own, then it's perfectly legitimate to say, look, let's get rid of these and let them find their value in the market. As I said at the beginning, some of these will find great value as going concerns. Some of them will find great value as real estate or other things. But that is something that the process must decide. It's not a decision that can be taken by the policymaker, or not a judgment that can be made by the policymaker. Let the best value be found by whoever is willing to pay it. Now, once you have that, this fits into the larger strategic picture that I was saying. Is what are the assets that the government should legitimately own? Should it own companies that make automobiles? Should it own companies that make scooters? Should it own companies that provide aviation services? Or should it own power plants or hospitals or water supply or things like that? I think that's a fundamental judgment, a fundamental reorientation, and we have to keep in mind that the evolution of the public sector enterprise cohort, the body, has been very mixed. There was the industrial policy orientation in the 50s, but after that, there was a whole spate of nationalizations. I mean, from what I understand, I may be wrong in this, but I heard that the most valuable company in the public sector fold is the National Textile Corporation, because of the prime land that the mills that it took over, or the mills that were taken over and folded into the NTC, because the land that they own, they're not producing any cloth or anything of any significance, but they own enormous amounts of very, very valuable land in cities like Mumbai. Now, if that is the case, should the government be sitting on these assets? And, what is the social value that is being generated from the ownership of the assets? I mean, that's a very fundamental question that has to drive the disinvestment process. I don't think we should be worried about whether it's going to make the companies more efficient, because many of these companies actually don't deserve to be around, don't deserve to be in existence.
Right.
Let's not worry about that. Look at the best way to get the government the most amount of money it can for the assets that is about to sell.
Right. Okay. We sort of, as we conclude, let me come back to you, Mr. Haldea. So, the one lesson from the past, and we've obviously attempted disinvestment and succeeded to some extent in many cases, and including privatization as well. The one lesson you feel from a market and an appetite point of view that, or a mistake we should not make, and the one thing that we could do differently this time, particularly as would be articulated in the budget.
I think the SEBI has already set the ball rolling by saying that the PSU should go for a 25% public shareholding. As far as appetite is concerned, I think the kind of companies that we are looking at, all the prices are already discounted by the facts of, there's a government company, there could be ministerial, etc., etc. I think all those factors are already discounted in the price. The important thing is for I've been suggesting that for listed stocks, in case you want to do institutional sales and not just retail, which is what I've been advocating, then the better method would not be to do an OFS or an FPO where you are competing with your own market price, and therefore we've seen these prices being beaten badly. I think we should take the market by surprise just a day before you want to and do an auction, a closed auction, where there could be institutional investors who are willing to pay a price even higher than the market price because they are acquiring a key asset on a long-term basis. We have seen is, in the last couple of years, we've seen that FPOs or offers for sale are announced almost a month to 2 in advance. The market starts beating the price. The government is then forced to price it according to the current market price, and then the price rises after the OFS has been done. So I think the case the government wants to maximize its revenues through institutional sales, then we should go through a closed auction method.
And your advice on the primary market is, you were saying, a 15% discount. Did I hear that right?
Yes, or to go 100% retail. People talk about depth of the retail market. I just want to give an example, not in terms of returns to the investors, but in terms of the appetite that the retail investor has. Reliance Power came out with an IPO 5 years ago. 49,900 crores was put in by retail. When I say retail, people applying for 1 lakh rupees and less. And this was not, this is not a small amount. 50,000 crores in just one IPO. I think retail investors have been out of equity for a long time. They are looking at opportunities. PSUs offer a good opportunity, give them a discount to the market price, money will come, and the objective of disinvestment, which is not only to raise money for the government, but also to increase transparency and finally to increase the depth of the capital market. I think all these three objectives can be met by doing a slightly more focused and a different kind of strategy than what we have followed in the last 4 or 5 years.
Right. Okay. So do an auction ahead of the offer. Do not give a gap like it was there before, and of course make it interesting for retail. They're there because they've at a good price with good supply. They're going to come out there in droves. Okay. Subir, your quick sort of lesson from the past that we should either heed or not heed, and what could we do differently this time?
Well, I think the main lesson that we should not heed or should, not even a lesson, I think it's a premise. We should not be looking at this as a process by which we want to make public enterprises more efficient. I think that has been the spoiler in this whole assessment. Right. We should be looking at it as a process by which the government rebalances its asset portfolio for the public good, or to be consistent with development and welfare objectives of the country. And let's work from that. Let's not worry about this efficiency business. I don't think that's going to get us anywhere. Let's just realize the maximum value we can and put it to good use. That's the second dimension. No point in selling off these assets if you're not going to put the realizations to good use. So those are two dimensions I think we have to look at in sync.
Right. Okay, Mr. Vyas, last word. Your one lesson from the past, and one thing that we could do differently, perhaps, if we were to go ahead with accelerated disinvestment or divestment now.
Well, going since this entire discussion pertains to the budget, one lesson from the past which emerges loud and clear is that so far, whatever were the estimates, they have been highly unsuccessful in even realizing 50% of the estimates that they placed in the budget of disinvestment targets and assume possible revenue because of that. So I think budget makers must approach this with not only a pinch of salt but handful of salt while they make their targets. That why in past these targets were not realized, and what is that now that they are going to do, that the targets which they are fixing in the budget estimates are going to be realized. I think ultimately the final success of this entire exercise would depend upon how best and how fast you are going to achieve the targets which are kept for the budget. And unfortunately, so far, the record of disinvestment is not that very promising or not that very healthy.
Right, Mr. Vyas, thank you for that. Well, so very important lessons and takeaways from here: transparency, focus on raising value from what is embedded within these enterprises. Don't focus on making them better or more efficient. We've, in some senses, crossed that bridge. Once we've decided to go ahead, then manage the offer process more efficiently. There are some clear lessons there. Obviously, make it attractive to retail investors. Not only will they come in, but also that will help revive the markets, which is another issue that's been hanging for a while. And of course, set careful targets so that you don't overstretch and then under-deliver on this. And that's the lesson as we go ahead into the union budget, for particularly from a divestment, disinvestment, perhaps leading to privatization in some cases. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on this India Hangout special with Business Standard. We're going to be back soon.